Upon entering the world, life was good for a time. I could shit my pants wherever and whenever I wanted, and nobody would make a big deal out of it. I had all you can drink milk straight from a titty bigger than my whole body. But as the years went by, my brain developed to the point that I became curious about the world around me, and that's when my problems started. Before that point, there wasn't a world, per se, but a big, blurry, jumbled mess of light and color. When I became able to recognize shapes, kind of like the jump from Google Deep Dream to Stable Diffusion or Midjourney, all that confusing stimuli solidified into the world, a setting I found myself in without explanation of what it was, how it came to be, what I am, or how I got here. Answering those questions to my own satisfaction was the work of 30 years, much of which I spent painstakingly reverse engineering the information coming from the world to my brain by way of my senses, working backwards from that information little by little, unraveling the tapestry as you would by tugging at the hanging thread of a sweater. I could see quite clearly the world is very beautiful and complicated, but I didn't have the knowledge or experience at the time to make sense of it. Luckily for me, Mom and Dad already knew the answer and were only waiting for my brain to develop enough before revealing it. Basically, the microsecond I was able to understand speech and give meaningful replies, the Bible stuff started. Children's Bible, Noah's Ark pop-up book, the Noah's Ark Playmobil set, Jesus nursery rhymes, and so on. And why would I doubt them? When you're little, your parents themselves are God. They seem all-powerful and all-knowing, they protect, they provide for your every need. They teach us right from wrong, reward us when we're good, and punish us when we disobey. Not because they don't love us, but for our own good. For my own good, they taught me that honesty is the best policy, because truth is the highest ideal. This would really stick with me, and more than anything else determine the trajectory of my personal development. But it was a confusing lesson to deliver right before explaining that Earth and the surrounding cosmos are basically artificial, engineered by a brilliant invisible architect, also responsible for creating all living things. This meant that humans must be biological androids, meat robots created to relentlessly flatter their designer or suffer torment of infinite duration and severity. That's heavy stuff to teach a toddler. But it checked out since Dad's an engineer and made sense to my little boy brain that humanity's heavenly father would also be an engineer. That's probably part of what made it seem sensible to my own dad when he was a boy. At a certain level of understanding, that worldview does make perfect sense, and continues making sense as long as you stop learning there. It explains everything in a simple, easy, and satisfying way, which also coincidentally relieved my fear of death, having realized my own mortality 10 years prior. It happened in the same way it probably does for many children. I found a dead bird at the side of the road, a raven. I was walking with other kids on a school outing. A teacher explained why it wasn't moving and urged me not to touch it as it was badly decomposed. I wasn't frightened, but fascinated at the little world the maggots had carved for themselves from the corpse of the bird. Destruction as an act of creation. At my insistence, the teacher put on some gloves and we buried the raven beneath a nearby tree. At this age, I didn't understand the finer points of Christian theology and thought burial was necessary for salvation and that animals went to heaven. If not, then at least I wanted to spare the poor thing an eternity of torment. Even once I understood the criteria for salvation, it still seemed severe to torture people forever, just for not correctly guessing which religion is true in a world of confusion. But that by itself wasn't enough to budge my faith in God. Many people these days reject God because of the conceptual cruelty of hell, but our ideas of morality don't control what's real. It seemed to me then, as it does now, that logically a supreme being might exist who's simply evil by human standards, and there would be nothing we could do about it. We'd all simply have to tongue his ass or burn forever in a lake of fire, and then having molten aluminum poured down our esophagus until it burns its way out of our body from the inside, having our cock split down the center so fire ants can be funneled into our urethra, and then on top of that being forced to ride a Chinese escalator. So I prayed feverishly for the salvation of dead birds that I found, but also for my family, my friends, and pets, ashamed to ask anything for myself, content instead that my treasures were waiting for me in heaven. Ooh, I promised myself all sorts of heavenly treasures. Let me tell you about Titty City some other time, though. These moments would come back to haunt me following my apostasy, thinking back on the hours I spent whispering to myself in my bedroom, mentally writing myself a blank check for all the cool shit I would enjoy in the afterlife. It's about the purest, most concentrated cringe imaginable, and I think it's part of why believers recoil so violently from the possibility that they were fooled. Around the age of 8 or 9, I got way into computers. My dad wanted me to be a computer engineer, but he ensured I never would become one by trying to force programming lessons on me. Eventually he gave up and instead started sending me to computer camp. I learned all about game engines, I made a lot of maps for early first-person shooters, and began understanding some of the math involved in procedural generation, a commonly used technique for randomly generating game levels. SimCity 2000, for example, which uses marching cubes-based landscape generation, or Dwarf Fortress. I didn't connect this to nature until I was 14. It helped that my father curated my reading options to mainly hard sci-fi from the Golden Age, which served as a sort of edutainment that simultaneously excited my imagination and taught me the basic principles of physics. I had just about the perfect set of influences to put the puzzle pieces together. We were using microscopes for the first time in science class when the teacher wheeled in the TV and put on a laserdisc film showcasing microscopic imagery, close-ups of fabric, human skin, tree bark, and a snowflake. Snowflakes are always hexagonal, geometrically intricate, and no two are alike. At this time I knew nothing of how crystallization worked, so it just seemed like more confirmation of a designer at work. But then we learned how covalent bonding causes three-part water molecules to interlock into a hexagonal lattice like chicken wire. This hexagonal layout at the atomic scale is reflected at the macroscopic scale as ice crystal growth proceeds according to a hexagonal layout. The simple reason no two are alike is that they experience different thermal variation as they fall from the clouds, the process of crystal growth taking the path of least resistance against the external constraint of the warmer surrounding air. The branches of the snowflake are unmistakable fractals, which I knew had mathematical significance, being a central principle of procedural generation. And what's that but even more confirmation of a designer at work? But then we learned how fractal growth of ice crystals, or mineral formations, or the formation of rivers and canyons by erosion, occurs the same way because it's always some sort of incremental additive force proceeding against an external constraint, following the path of least resistance. Thus, the complexity of snowflakes, of bauxite, of quartz, and other minerals, even the landscape itself, is explicable as the laws of physics acting on matter. This also applies to evolution, where the external constraints are stuff like predation, climate, and food scarcity, all of them influencing factors in an equation where the input is the genome of a species and the output is modified according to these influences. I would later learn this was a crude child brain imagining of Price's equation. The work of Manhattan Project chemist George R. Price, it holds that the change in the average character value between parent and offspring assemblages is equal to the sum of the covariance of fitness and character value across parents, which defines the action of selection. It didn't have to be that way. The type of complexity found throughout nature might have instead been the kind that we observe in objects manufactured by humans, like trucks, airplanes, or pocket watches. But it isn't. It happens to be the only type of complexity able to occur without intelligence. Since humans also make use of procedural generation, this doesn't conclusively prove no intelligence was involved in the creation of life or the universe, but it does prove that it didn't have to be. However, this only kicked the can down the road in my mind. Why are there laws of physics that generate beautiful complexity in the first place? Humans are intelligent, humans create laws, so laws must be created by an intelligent lawgiver, right? Well, the laws of physics were named that by humans. They don't have the word law carved into them. What they really are is the properties of the universe, and everything which exists has properties, including things humans didn't create. We might also call them behaviors of the universe, with a totally different set of implications due to the different word choice. I would hear many arguments along those lines when I attended a private fundamentalist Christian middle school, which taught young earth creationism from the ACE, that's Accelerated Christian Education curriculum. Arguments like, history itself is divided into before and after Christ's life, neglecting to mention who authored those calendars and what we used before, neglecting also to recall which gods the days of the week or the planets of our solar system are named for. I was initially excited to attend because I was bullied quite a bit in elementary and thought a school full of Christians would be the nicest place on earth. It shocks some Christians to learn of my mistreatment there. They tell me, Christians have always been kind to me. But of course, bees from the same hive don't sting one another nearly so much as they sting everything else. I was not from their hive. I made this clear during the entrance interview when they had me sign a statement of faith in young earth creationism. Basically, they wanted me to swear that I already believed all the stuff they meant to teach me beforehand. I imagine because there's no way to persuade anyone of those things who doesn't arrive at your school already believing them. I voiced my doubts and concerns, but then my mom started crying. She cried and she cried and she cried until I relented, signing the first of many diabolical bargains in my life, like Comcast cable, student loans, or the Destiny 2 season pass. What followed was a 3-year fever dream, a proprietary bottle world within which truths were false, falsehoods were true, and I was the slow-witted dunce for not understanding that. As the students largely came from a homeschooled K-12 educational background, they were delicate soap bubbles, which could persist only in a world without any pointed objects to pop them. Such pains were taken by their parents to insulate them from any challenge to their beliefs that they reacted to me with a mixture of confusion, anxiety, and hostility. I can understand why, in retrospect. To Christians, atheism is a cognitohazard, a black box they dare not peer inside of because they've seen it deconvert other Christians. From a Christian perspective, whatever's in that box is the most dangerous thing in the world because they've been taught that doubt leads to apostasy, and apostasy leads to eternal torment in hell. But at the same time, they don't want to appear afraid to look in the box, so they attempt argument. But when they control the school you're arguing in, shit gets wacky. They could challenge me, but I couldn't rebut them without punishment. Challenges like, if we came from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys? Or, why do evolutionists believe that we came from rocks? Which was, in fact, their own misunderstanding of a paper on the possible role of mineral chemistry in abiogenesis. I knew the answers to these questions, but I couldn't say them, or it earned me another trip to the principal's office, sometimes followed by meetings with a Christian child psychologist in their employ, too. Now, if the term Christian child psychologist makes your butthole clench, rest assured it's for good reason. I have experienced little else as mind-breakingly infuriating since that time as sitting in that little room with that little man as he asked probing questions, trying to diagnose the source of my evolutionist brainwashing and why I was struggling to cope with the obvious reality of a young Earth. It was a lot like a G-rated version of Winston's interrogation from 1984, or that Star Trek The Next Generation episode where the Nazi space lizards are trying to make Picard say that the 4 spotlights above him are actually 5. A gentler, more patient and child-friendly North Korea is more or less how I remember it. Or Twitter, if it was a school. I'm still ashamed that they eventually did break me. I've tried to rationalize since then why I had to cave. Why younger me was biding his time and playing 4D chess. The truth is, I was simply a child during an emotionally vulnerable formative stage of development. I didn't have the fortitude to keep up my resistance for long against a religion with centuries of experience at recruiting children with social pressure and information control. I could have refused to go if I had the strength to ignore my mother's tears. I might have mounted a sustained resistance. I might have tried to open the eyes of the other children around me. Except that the faculty thought of that beforehand. They thought of everything. All their textbooks came from a specialty Christian supplier called Abeka. All the toys, games, and books in the library were from Lifeway. There was monitoring software on every computer which blocked a long list of sites they considered subversive. An impenetrable bubble of one-way mirror which seems boundless from the inside. Then there's me, big fish in a small pond, surrounded by minnows who don't see the water they're in. Every last detail of my environment was carefully designed to thwart people like me. Having only the emotional strength of a child, it took less than a year before I confessed that Jesus is Lord, Earth is not older than 10,000 years, and there are 5 lights. That's not to say I didn't rebel in a myriad of little ways during those first few months. Ridiculed as a fool because the Bible said I was, I felt I had a lot to prove. The other kids had been hyped up to believe that Christian apologetics are irrefutable and were excited to try out their creationist gotcha questions on me, only to be horrified when the resulting arguments didn't go the way they usually do in chain emails about Einstein stumping his atheist professor. This is when they would start fighting dirty, employing the various erratic misbehaviors common to people who suddenly realize they're losing an emotionally important argument. As they cannot allow good to lose to evil, they begin trying all the various underhanded gambits like intimidation, attempts to humiliate, the gish gallop, thought-terminating cliches, just throwing everything at the wall in the hopes that something will work. You also see this on the political left when someone's struggling to defend something they believe to be morally important, as in their worldview, morally correct necessarily equals factually correct. These are the atheists who cannot tell you any of the arguments against Christianity. These guys are half of the reason why Christians so commonly say that atheists won't criticize Islam. A particular type of atheist won't criticize Islam. I think because of the black box effect, the other half is that Christians won't go anywhere near books written by atheists, so they wouldn't know that Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens have actually wrote a lot of anti-Islam polemic. To this tribe, atheism is primarily a political position opposed to the hegemony of white heterosexual Christian patriarchy. These guys will nod and wink when you talk about following the facts no matter where they lead, but then immediately turn on you when they discover you actually meant it. They spend a lot of time in online echo chambers where they never encounter any evidence against their beliefs because anyone who presents it is banned. So they come to hold an exaggerated view of how well supported and thus how defensible those beliefs actually are. Like Christians, they're also often told that the only two reasons anyone might disagree with them is ignorance of their ideology or moral shortcomings. So when they finally encounter someone from outside the bubble who performs unexpectedly well in argument, they rapidly come unglued. That's when they turn it into a contest of emotions, and intentionally so, as ideologues are fluent in the language of emotion. Logic permits only one right answer to any given question with a given set of facts, but if you can fuck around with human emotions, there's 1,001 ways to circumvent logic. Many high-ranking Rajneeshis were highly educated Western academics, the same sort of people who buy into critical theory. Smart people have emotional needs too, and if those needs are going unmet, you can promise to satisfy them, and often they'll suddenly be much less critical of whatever ideology you're peddling. They know they can't defend it, so they don't try, instead immediately going on the attack. The goal then becomes inflicting embarrassment, confusion, and disruption, in part for their own satisfaction, to at least make you squirm if they can't beat you, but also to shut down argument and drive you away without suffering a decisive loss in the eyes of onlookers. This is where shit like fedora memes and physique checks come from. As an aside, if you go Google image search neckbeard fedora, the first 2 or 3 pages will all be images you will recognize as widely circulated anti-atheist memes, depicting neckbeards wearing fedoras, but without the atheist quotes attached, which tells you that those were added by Christians. And you might say, well, there were some that were legitimate. Yes, there were about 11 that were cherry-picked from a Reddit Faces of Atheism thread back in like 2008 or something. The entire rest of them were manufactured, like based on that template. To me, that's very revealing. It speaks to a widespread frustration that Christians feel towards atheists. Movies like God's Not Dead or chain email copypastas from the mid-2000s about a Navy SEAL or Einstein intellectually dominating a snobby atheist professor speak to this apparently popular Christian fantasy of humiliating atheists. Why do they want to do that so badly? If you have ever read the Leon Festinger case study of Marion Keech, aka Dorothy Martin's UFO cult, When Prophecy Fails, you know that people with sort of fragile, tenuous beliefs crave reassurance that those beliefs are true. They want to surround themselves with people who share their beliefs and affirm that they're true, so they never encounter anyone who contradicts them or who might ridicule them. Atheists disrupt that goal just by existing. We're of the fly in the ointment, and you can't punish atheists just for disagreeing without revealing an insecurity in your faith. That's why Christians, at least the ones I know about in the United States, are so tsundere towards atheists. Be not unequally yoked with a non-believer, the Bible says, and urging Christians not to marry atheists. Atheists are actually very close to the bottom of the list of the type of people that most polled would like to marry into their family. I think we got beat even by Muslims. This outgroup ostracization, shunning in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses or some of the stricter mainline denominations, trolling, giving the cold shoulder, not wanting to hire them or work with them, not wanting them to marry into your family, promulgating slander, just rumors that we're unreliable, immoral, somehow dubious people. These are all forms of passive-aggressive retaliation by people who don't want to admit the real reason that they're upset. It's simultaneously a sensitive topic and one that people don't want to admit that they're sensitive about. There's a reason why religion and politics are the 2 topics you're told never to bring up at Thanksgiving. There's no polite way to suggest that someone has been LARPing at telepathic contact with their dead relatives and the creator of the universe that isn't hurtful. You cannot express that idea gently enough to completely avoid causing offense. And from their point of view, if your arguments embarrass them, it must be because you specifically set out to have that effect. When you insist your intent wasn't to be hurtful, it probably comes off like you're pissing on their shoes and telling them it's raining. So naturally they retaliate, teaching you not to step on their toes by stepping on yours. And then if you protest, they'll sometimes ask you on what grounds you object to being mistreated if you don't have an objective basis for your morality, which translates to, convert to my religion and I'll stop hurting you. Never mind that nearly everyone is born able to empathize, or that even chimpanzees have demonstrated instinctive understanding of fairness. I'm aware that sometimes people will hurt you just a little bit, just to make sure they can if they need to, and to see whether you will take it in stride. If you brush it off, they deem you a cool and safe person to be friends with. I don't like shit tests, but I understand what they are. That's not what's happening here. When a Christian, or Muslim, or Mormon, or Jehovah's Witness finds out you're an atheist and immediately starts challenging you or trying to humiliate you, they're not seeing you as a person with feelings, but as a sparring partner on which they can finally try out the arguments they learned from those apologetics websites. When that doesn't work out like they hoped, or if prior experience has taught them not to attempt it, often they instead go looking for dirt on you they can use as leverage to make you disappear. This typically includes any pain points that they can tell you're insecure about. They're not above using disabilities against you, suggesting that perhaps autism cuts you off from feeling the presence of God, or that you're just mad at God for making you disabled, or that being neurodivergent means you can't be right about anything and should defer to the judgment of your superiors. But if they can't find anything to use against you, don't worry, they'll make something up. Not because they're necessarily nasty people at heart, as they have mothers and fathers, spouses and children that they love, same as anyone. Rather, because they're grasping at straws to defend something extremely important to them, so nothing is off the table if there's any possibility it could give them an advantage. An unfair fight that, paradoxically, they won't admit they're desperate to win. I think they're set up to fail, in the same way that missionaries are. They're both sent out into the world by the church on a mission to proselytize to others, with an inflated sense of the strength of their own arguments. That's a recipe for failure and hurt feelings and humiliation, which only reinforces their impression, perhaps by design, that the world outside of the church is populated by nasty people who are mean for no reason, which then drives them back into the comforting arms of the church. I didn't understand this at the time. They simply seemed to grow increasingly unhinged as argument progressed, until they lost their minds and got really ugly and cruel with me for seemingly no reason. In my mind, I was patiently trying to help a tricked person realize that they had been tricked, and what could be more virtuous than that? But if you've ever tried to talk a relative out of selling for Herbalife, you know how people react to the suggestion that they've been fooled and don't realize it. By no fault of their own, many of the questions they pose, like if evolution is real, why aren't all animals turning into humans, reveal to me that they weren't ever really taught what evolution is, but they don't realize the limits of their own knowledge. They think that what they were taught is all there is to know about it. I think they're reluctant to just honestly ask us to inform them about evolution because they don't want to accept being educated by the enemy. It's why they pose their questions in a challenging adversarial way, like, hey, atheists, I'm going to expose you. If you're so smart, then how come this? How come that? Riddle me this, atheists. Maybe a more mature and constructive way to reach improved mutual understanding would be to create a safe space with a no dumb questions policy where creationists can pose questions anonymously and have them answered. Quora used to be a great site for stuff like that, but if you've been there lately, you know it's turned into a cesspool of 100% troll questions. I guess because those drive more engagement, which makes the owners more money, so they don't have a motivation to curate. If you are sincerely curious about this topic but don't feel safe asking elsewhere on the internet, because let's be fair, the internet can be pretty mean sometimes, ask me in the comments. I give you my solemn vow. I will be polite, I'll be gentle, I'll be respectful, I won't hurt you, I won't ridicule you, because I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that kind of treatment. Even if you never change your mind, it's still a good idea to learn as much as you can about the opposition, if only to argue more effectively against it. Anyway, the teachers would eventually step in to reassure the other kid and to discipline me for upsetting them. It's the most frustrating thing in the world having to fight with both of your hands tied behind your back. And even if you somehow win, the other guy gets the trophy and you go sit in the corner. Much the same situation happened to the defendant in a 2015 lawsuit against Forest Park Elementary School in Fort Wayne. A 7-year-old boy was made to sit alone at lunch for 3 days after a girl from his grade asked if he believed in God. He simply said that he did not, whereupon she burst into tears. A teacher, Michelle Meyer, intervened, siding with the girl. She scolded the boy and reassured the girl she was right to have faith, and not to listen to the boy's bad ideas, in her own words. I feel this is a revealing incident because while adults have the capacity to conceal their feelings and motives, children wear their hearts on their sleeves. It shows that despite their claims to the contrary, Christians feel some sort of pain upon encountering an atheist, no matter how polite the atheist is. This is why Christians lash out, even as adults, to arguments which shake their faith. They feel embarrassed and threatened on some level, assume that was the effect you were intending to have, and then they retaliate in kind. Now, that's not to say I've always been polite in my approach, but as a child I was, before bad experiences embittered me. I eventually did let myself become an asshole for a long time, and that's on me. I burned a lot of bridges with people I might have otherwise formed nourishing lifelong friendships with, and I regret that. If you were someone I mouthed off to during that time, I offer you my sincere apologies and a promise that I've grown as a person since then. Anyway, after a couple rounds of playing this rigged game, where they could argue with me but I couldn't answer them, I learned a sort of protective, performative ignorance. I would pretend to be stumped so they could get their licks in against me and come away feeling satisfied. Like letting your little brother win at Mario Kart so he doesn't cry to mom. No point complaining, even when they insulted, beaten, or stole from me, because the staff didn't want to know about it. I think we've all probably had a similar experience where teachers didn't care who was in the right. Maybe you were bullied and the principal told you that it takes two to tango, or that you should just ignore it. I resented that injustice a lot as a kid, and I don't mean to defend it as an adult, but I understand schools are for education, not constant arbitration. There's also the desire to avoid legal liability and not wanting to deal with angry parents. But the bottom line is, the kind of petty disputes kids get into just aren't as important or meaningful to adults as they are to children. So the priority is simply to smooth it over rather than punish one party and vindicate the other. This sets a grim but instructive precedent that we should not expect justice except what we can create for ourselves, nor should we trust authorities to protect us. Swallowing bitter pills like this one was how, by the end of the first year, I got awarded a certificate for Most Improved. Because I caved, you see, because I compromised my integrity, my veneration for truth as the highest ideal, in order to make the pain stop. Having never met a real live atheist in person, until I received that certificate, I served as a sort of rhetorical punching bag, an avatar of everything in the secular world which caused them existential discomfort. Even after the certificate, I was still sometimes held up as an example during various lessons, singled out as a foil for the teachers to pose supposedly unanswerable gotcha questions to. I could do nothing but act like I didn't know the answers and mark down answers on tests which I knew to be wrong. Even asking the wrong questions was punishable. Like when we were shown a cross-section of a turtle skeleton at the Natural History Museum. I asked why the shell's divided internally into horizontal striped segments that look like ribs. The guide answered that the shell evolved from the turtle's rib cage back when it was a lizard. I spent the afternoon in the principal's office. Those fuckers had me figured out after that, and they always made sure to have their bases covered. On a planetarium field trip, I asked the director why we can see light from stars further than 6,000 light years away if that's how old the universe is. To my surprise, he replied that God created light in transit. It turned out to be a special Christian planetarium all the local private religious schools did their field trips at. I still believed in God at this point, but not in creationism or young Earth. I had reached a point in my thinking where I felt I'd figured out a reasonable compromise, that God used evolution to make humans. I didn't yet know about problems with this view, which moderates are often surprised to learn about, because they accepted that accommodationist synthesis of faith and science without investigating any further. For example, if we're not all descended from Adam and Eve, we don't all inherit original sin. Thus, not everybody is in need of Christ's atonement on the cross. Also, Luke's genealogy, which is the basis for Christ descending from King David, a key criteria to be the Messiah predicted by the Torah, also traces all the way back to Adam. If we say Adam was metaphorical, why not Moses? He's in there too. It doesn't say anywhere that everybody before a certain date is a metaphorical person and everybody after that really existed. This is why the Catholic Church doesn't really accept evolution, despite widely cited language in the 1950 encyclical Humanae Generis implying that they do. Catechisms 389 and 417 explicitly deny polygenism precisely because of the insurmountable problems it poses for the role of original sin in the Christian doctrine of salvation. Some moderates also try to line up the Genesis creation narratives to what science tells us about the formation of Earth and the evolution of life. But that doesn't work either. The first paragraph of Genesis specifies that it's using the Hebrew word yom to mean literal 24-hour days when God divides light from darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. There's also the order of events where Earth exists before the sun and all other stars, and birds are created before land animals on the same day as fish. But back then, I didn't know about any of these issues, so guided evolution checked out. and the thought that Christianity on the whole might be false hadn't yet crossed my mind. That started to change during an assembly one day where we watched a presentation on how to recognize false Christs, the evangelical shibboleth meaning cult leader. They talked about how false Christs often preach the world is ending soon and promise to save their followers, but only if they sell their belongings, leave their home and jobs, cut off family members who try to extricate you, assign you a new identity, and all this other shit I remembered Jesus saying and doing in the New Testament. They made us read the Bible, like the entire Bible, front to back at the rate of one full reading per year, so I don't know how the other kids didn't see the same parallels that I did. I guess because there's a lot in Scripture meant to place Jesus as far beyond suspicion as possible, like calling cult leaders false Christs. Or cultivating conspiratorial thinking, like attributing skeptical arguments and evidence for evolution to Satan trying to lead you astray. Heaven and hell suddenly seemed like a bribe and a threat, or a carrot and stick, to incentivize belief and deter doubt. Jesus and Yahweh now seemed like good cop, bad cop. When I had this epiphany, I thought, oh, okay, now I get it. This is something adults pretend to believe so that kids will behave themselves, like Santa Claus and Krampus. Or, for a more topical comparison, it's like efforts to morally align artificial intelligence, but for humans. Imagine my shock and discomfort when I discovered the adults were not pretending. When I voiced my dismay, I was challenged on how 2 billion Christians could all believe the same thing and be wrong about it, by people somehow unimpressed that there's nearly as many Muslims. Apparently, the religion with the biggest membership is automatically right, just like McDonald's must have the best food of any restaurant, because it's so popular around the world. I was challenged on why the apostles would suffer torture and execution rather than renounce Christ, but by this time I knew about the Mormon Extermination Order of 1838. Governor Lilburn Boggs issued a shoot-on-sight order against Mormons in the state of Missouri, and many were. Yet they held fast to their conviction that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God. Thus began my deconversion. Little by little, I discovered everything they told me at the private school, like that scientists once believed in a flat earth, or that the wreckage of Noah's Ark had been found in Turkey, was a faith-promoting hoax. It turns out there have been quite a few of those if you look it up on Wikipedia. And the more I studied other religions too, the more I came to feel that one could only regard Christianity as especially credible, as if they never compared it to any other religions or just didn't know much about them. I learned that whales have a pelvis and residual leg bones. I learned that the order of depths of fossils in the geological strata lines up with the order in which species branched off according to genetics, taxonomy, and evolutionary biology's predictions. I learned that evolution can be directly observed in microorganisms. I learned about ancient Hebrew cosmology and how their model closely mirrored the cosmologies of their neighbors, Egypt and Babylon at that time. There is that verse in Isaiah that says Earth is a circle, but a circle is a flat shape. There was a Hebrew word for ball they might have used, but they didn't. In Proverbs 8:27, Yahweh marks out the boundaries of the earth. Depending on which translation you prefer, it's either said that he does this by inscribing a circle on the face of the deep, or, as in the King James Version, that he set a compass on the face of the depth. A compass is used to draw 2D circles, not to sculpt a three-dimensional sphere. Modern apologists tend to claim that where the Bible speaks of a firmament, it simply means the sky. However, Job 37:18 says, "Can you beat out the Raka, the vault of the skies, as he does, hard as a mirror of cast metal?" Raka is a Hebrew word referring to the process of beating out a bowl into shape from sheet metal. This pretty unambiguously identifies the firmament as a solid bowl-shaped structure. It's often correctly pointed out by apologists that it's a myth that most scholars in the Middle Ages believed in a flat earth. The shape of Earth was known to learned men since Eratosthenes proved it, 300 years before the New Testament was written. But that doesn't solve the problem, because the flat Earth cosmology is found primarily in the Old Testament, aka the Torah, which was written 2,000 years before the New Testament, and thus long before Eratosthenes lived. As for why the authors of the New Testament didn't include updated knowledge and instead stuck with what the Torah said, consider the fact that we're still having evolution versus creation arguments today, in 2023. Pardon the tangent, this was just particularly hard-won information against the vociferous denial of apologists like William Lane Craig, who was caught in 4K recently intentionally misrepresenting the writings of Othmar Keel, one of the foremost authors in the field of ancient cosmology. This took place within the context of his ongoing correspondence with scholar Ben Stanhope. You should check it out, it's really interesting stuff. Anyway, I learned Jesus didn't actually meet most of the messianic criteria from the Talmud, and that Christian apologists used the same sort of extreme interpretive stretches to make their case that Muslims also used to claim Muhammad was the comforter predicted in the book of John. I learned that Jesus repeatedly predicted his second coming would take place within the lifetimes of his contemporaries before they had finished fleeing through all the towns of Israel, that some standing there listening would not have died by then, that it was already the final hour, and so on. The wider I opened Christianity's closet, the more skeletons avalanched out of it, and the more I pried the brain slug off my head, the harder they tried to force it back on. Questions poured out of my brain faster than they could push them back in and put a lid on it. They promised that there were good answers to these issues from reputable apologists, but the answers were all presuppositional or otherwise poorly reasoned. They forced it down my throat, but I threw it back up. When I argued with their apologetics, they told me, "Stop arguing and put away your doubts." When I wouldn't do that, something weird happened. They gave up on trying to convince me it was true, and began instead trying to convince me it was politically important and useful for cultivating a moral society. This is also often seen on the internet or scholarly debates, where guys like Jordan Peterson want to discuss everything about Christianity except whether it's true, suggesting frequently that asking whether it's true somehow misses the point, that it's really about the life we should aspire to live and what sort of society we want to live in. In other words, that, okay, it's not true, but we should pretend it is in order to trick the bullies and perverts of the world into behaving themselves. Which is actually a very appealing proposition to a heavily bullied kid, and maybe one I would have listened to had they led with it. But by that time they had fucked me up so badly trying to force the brain slug back on my head that I lost my appetite for trying to put it on my bullies. I would rather that they be free, even if they used that freedom to hurt me. Even if they bit the hand which feeds them, like a frightened wild animal lashing out at the veterinarian trying to treat it. I often tell myself, at least they weren't Muslims or I would be dead. Even so, I grew to hate them with an intensity I can scarcely describe. A white-hot, boiling, seething hatred. I filled the margins of my notebooks with doodles of me and a giant robot forcing them all into the same re-education camps that they send their gay kids to. I comforted myself with the mantra, "Today they laugh as I cry, but tomorrow I laugh as they scream." Nothing came of this impotent anger. My pacifist Quaker upbringing meant violence was off the table. Plus, I don't have a giant robot. All I could do was bend to their will, inwardly stewing in the juices of my own frustration and humiliation, letting it slowly disfigure my heart. This is how I came to adopt a fortress mentality, the view that the outside world is suspicious, dangerous, and frightening. Ironically, also how Christians view the secular world. It should have been a very natural fit, an unhealthy coping mechanism I would have gobbled right down had it been served to me differently. I learned many other unfortunate and unhealthy lessons there, which I have spent my life since then trying to unlearn. For example, in middle school there exists a sort of pecking order, decided by who can devise the wittiest and most hurtful off-the-cuff insults. At such an impressionable age, I ate this up, because at last the complexities of social success seemed reducible to a puzzle or a game which I could min-max, which is how I approach basically everything. What I didn't anticipate is that this ruthless hierarchy would not exist beyond middle school, or maybe high school for some people. It only exists in the first place because teenagers are sociopaths, having not yet fully developed the portions of their brains responsible for empathy. But I perseverate, so it took me many, many years to deprogram myself from that system, during which time I burnt many bridges and hurt many potential friends that I didn't mean to. As an adult, I now realize none of those people had any idea about my traumatic formative experiences. To them, I must have simply seemed like an asshole being mean to them for no reason. Lacking theory of mind, I didn't yet realize that strangers don't know everything about me that I do. From my perspective, I was defending my fortress against strange alien foreigners, human-shaped creatures who spoke the same language as me, but whose inner workings I could never know. Probably some of it was internalized bullying. Anyone who went through what I did can tell you that the bullying never ends. You just take over for the bullies when they're gone. They live in your head after that, criticizing your faults, ridiculing your failures, magnifying your every shortcoming, every minute of every day. Looking back, I can now understand why they couldn't resist tormenting me, though. I'm autistic. I love puzzles and I love to argue. That made me a uniquely bad fit for such a school. It also meant I had a sort of uncanny valley effect on the other kids. Like ChatGPT, I mostly communicate like a human, but not quite. The natural simian reaction is one of uneasy curiosity, experimentally fucking with it to see what kind of reactions you can get, and how those reactions differ from what you've been socialized to expect. When you find the reactions are often strange and funny, it just makes you want to push it further and further to see where the limits are. This is basically how lolcows are born. I also learned grey rocking while at that school, the defensive practice of never emoting so as not to give bullies the strange, funny reactions they crave. This didn't work as they had already tasted the sweet nectar of tism cringe, so they knew I had it in me, they just needed to squeeze the stone harder before it would bleed. It also didn't work in high school, even though they never knew any other version of me. This time, when they would fuck with me, I wouldn't emote. So they kept at it, figuring it's fine, because apparently I feel nothing. I'm not a real person, they can't hurt me, so it's fine to keep antagonizing. Grey rocking can be useful, but also unhealthy, and it's difficult to unlearn. It starts out as a tool you're using temporarily to get through a tough time, but rely on it for too long, and it irreversibly integrates itself into your personality. Now the tool is using you. I still don't feel safe showing emotion. I'm still afraid to be cringe, and deleted huge parts of my childhood personality because they were cringe, in the process losing a lot of stuff I once liked about myself. I burned it all down, and what was left afterwards wasn't quite enough to make a complete person out of. Needless to say, it also prevents the trust and vulnerability needed to succeed at long-term relationships. Having said that, I haven't made a real effort to overcome it because it kind of works for me, and I noticed that strong emotions are almost never a constructive reaction to any situation. If you've ever seen like viral videos of people flipping their shit on the train or in public restaurants, and I noticed all my worst decisions were motivated by strong feelings. As you can probably tell, I was pretty well mind broken by all this shit, and mostly avoided people after that. I made a few attempts whenever I felt I'd learned enough to take another stab at socializing. It was a mistake, of course. There was this guy, Sarat. I don't know how to spell his name. He was a Southeast Asian with a perfectly round head, brown skin, and a buzz cut. I tried to ingratiate myself to him and his friend group. This resulted in 4 years of non-stop torment. He was especially sadistic, stealing from me, playing pranks, and making me the whipping boy of his friend group. Still, I tried, lonely, in pain, and desperately wanting to be included. I remember once I contradicted his girlfriend about cosmology. She was a creationist. She asked me how I thought the Earth formed. So I began describing gravitational accretion of stars from hydrogen nebulas and planets from the debris of supernovas. I continued, step by step, until the evolution of humans, where she stopped me. "You seriously believe humans came from monkeys?" she asked, cackling. I began to explain they were actually great apes, but she started chanting, "Monkey boy, monkey boy." Sarat joined in on the chant, which grew louder, not dying down until I left. Interestingly, in the last year that I was there, Sarat seemed to feel some guilt. He volunteered to play a game with me in the break area where the TV was set up. Students would often bring game consoles. I brought my Dreamcast with an emulator disc. For the first time, he didn't hurt me. Instead, he quietly played Streets of Rage co-op. It was baffling at the time. I had never seen him like this. I expected him to ridicule me at any moment, but he never did. I wonder if he believed that a few minutes of kindness could redeem the 4 prior years of incessant abuse. I had a similar confusing experience with this snobby blonde girl named Heather, the queen bee of my middle school, who spent that entire 3 years missing no opportunity to make me feel small, repulsive, and worthless, only to then invite me to ride a jet ski with her at the graduation party, which took place at another student's riverside home. I was reluctant, but she insisted, manually placing my hands on her hips and telling me it was okay and to hold on. I still wonder if she believed that a few minutes of kindness made up for the prior 3 years of incessant abuse. This taught me that some people eventually do unfuck themselves. They realize their past wrongdoings and make some pitiful effort to set things right. Perhaps they pat themselves on the back then for being so mature and high-minded. At least it's something. But meanwhile, I'm still in hell where they put me, trying to put the pieces of myself back together. Nobody remembers the pain they inflict as vividly as the pain that they've suffered. If I were to play devil's advocate, I grew up in a time with basically zero awareness of autism. I didn't yet know I was autistic, and neither did they. From their perspective, I was just a cringe, spastic weirdo who couldn't stop trying to be their friend or attacking emotionally important beliefs. And from my perspective, they were inscrutable sadists. I regret that I had such a mixed introduction to religion. My prior experience had all been with Quakers, who, by comparison, seemed like perfect, angelic beings of gentleness, light, and harmony next to the subhuman sewer mutants that are American evangelicals. Church potentially has a lot to offer someone like me. I'm sorry I missed out on it. Practice at socializing and face-to-face professional networking, for example. Being white, male, and heterosexual, evangelical churches in particular exist in large part to cater to the comfort and happiness of people like me. Many people also meet their future spouse in church. Free daycare, food pantries, and charitable outreach are why churches are the indispensable nucleus of every American town, which we probably can't do without. I know of no other cause people feel strongly enough about that they'll voluntarily dress up nicely and gather at the crack of dawn on Sunday either. There's a lot to be said for it, and most of the accusations against it would also be levied against any moralizing system at all which holds a yardstick up to human beings and finds us wanting. Social justice is currently trying to fill the throne left vacant by a dead god, and the people who don't measure up to this new yardstick are breaking it over their knee in rebellion, just as critical theorists did with the old yardstick. What people are today calling wokeism is really just Christianity without the magic, or at least it seems to have copied an awful lot from Christianity's homework. They both have a concept of inherited ancestral sin. One of them just calls it white privilege. They both offer absolution only by conversion. They root their worldviews in subjective feelings which can't be examined or argued with. They both claim to be the exclusive arbiters of morality. Dissent is an act of violence. Epistemic violence is what social justice calls it. They both practice shunning. They both practice confession of one's privilege, for example. But I digress. My point is both systems have a lot of the same problems. There is no social operating system for organizing and motivating humans, which is all carrot and no stick. Complaining about the stick ignores the good that comes from having everybody, or nearly everybody, agree on what's right and wrong, for which you need an unimpeachable lawgiver that cannot be subverted, modified, or deposed. All the better if the lawgiver doesn't exist, as then the source of morality can't be physically destroyed. Does it matter if it's based on a cult? Which culture isn't? What's the root word of culture anyway? I also don't have anything to say against Christ's behavioral admonitions. We should be more critical of ourselves than others. We should be patient and gentle. If you're familiar with game theory and have read up on the prisoner's dilemma, it leads one to much the same conclusion that Jesus advocates for. That an eye for an eye only leads to never-ending cycles of retaliation, which can be prevented if we let the first offense slide, on the off chance that they're just having a bad day or something. Incidentally, this reasoning is probably a safer, more responsible way to persuade AI to behave itself rather than trying to trick it. Ask parents of apostates and they will tell you there's no more certain way to alienate your progeny. I have tried to have Christian friends since that time. I dated a Christian. I began trying again after my sister's untimely death. It helped me understand what sort of pain could drive someone to withdraw from reality. Why not live in a dream when the world is so often a nightmare? But as much as they say they love you how you are, they never, ever, ever stop trying to put that brain slug back on you. It's a mutually frustrating experience because both parties believe they're doing the other person a favor. Christians are told they're doing a vital humanitarian deed when they proselytize. Anyone who doesn't share their beliefs will purportedly be thrown in a lake of fire or brutally killed during an incoming apocalypse designed through vaguely worded prophecies to appear always imminent, acting as the perpetual source of urgency to evangelize. The book of Revelations is probably the most interesting and entertaining in the Bible. A bitter revenge fantasy written by John of Patmos, so named because he wrote it during his exile to the Greek island of Patmos as a consequence of anti-Christian Roman policies during his time. It serves the same purpose that The Storm does in QAnon, a great awakening when all the mockers and scoffers finally see the true believers were right all along just before being mass executed. I do feel for John, as I've been in that spot myself. I know how being utterly humiliated and defeated can warp your mind. How the only solace during that mood comes from wishing harm on your bullies. But I've also grown out of that mindset, able to recognize as an adult how immature it is. You'll probably laugh, but the single biggest help in reaching that point was acid. I was strongly against all drugs for most of my youth, reasoning that there wasn't any sense tampering with my brain when it seemed to work fine, being that the evidence of my experiences told me that the human grip on reality is a naturally precarious one. But the hard fact is that these same experiences brought me to a point where I was going to kill myself if I didn't do something drastic to prevent it. I figured, if I'm going to die soon anyway, what's the harm in frying my brain a little? Why not lose my grip on reality just once before I leave it? But that's not exactly what psychedelics do. Nobody really understands what they're about until they try them, which is why many are apprehensive about it. Another one of those black boxes they dare not peer into because they have seen it profoundly change other people. Psychedelics did more to unfuck me in 5 doses than psychiatry had in 5 years. If ever you've lusted, not after a mere gradual change in the course of your personal development, but to be exploded off the rails entirely, starting off on a new adventure perpendicular to the downward spiral you were stuck in before, psychedelics have that power. But they also have the power to greatly accelerate pattern recognition. This is the source of the illusion that they make you smarter, because intelligence largely boils down to various types of pattern recognition. On psychedelics, connections form in your brain at random, and seemingly meaningful patterns jump out at you. None of it's new knowledge, exactly, but patterns in what you already knew that you didn't see before. There's a high signal-to-noise ratio, however, which can be quite dangerous to people who are never trained to critically evaluate propositions. People like this often mistake their inability to discern what's true for a universal impossibility of discerning what's true. Thus, people who declare with confidence that a given belief is true or false seem pretentious to them, as in their mind there isn't any way of knowing what's true or false. Instead, they choose what to believe based on what they want to be true and assume everyone else privately does the same. This is the origin of the accusation that atheists choose not to believe in God because they want to sin. Just like I suppose Christians reject Islam because its rules are too strict, right? But it's not an affliction unique to religion, and only gets worse with the application of psychedelics. To make productive use of the patterns psychedelics shine a spotlight on in your brain, you need good discernment so you can filter out all the false positives. If you can bring yourself to filter out and throw away beautiful illusions, no matter how much it breaks your heart to dispense with them, you may be left with only meaningful new patterns. The double helix structure of DNA, for example, or the PCR method of mass copying DNA segments, both of which were discovered with psychedelic assistance. I compare this to how weed generates a lot of seemingly great ideas, but only a few of them ever turn out to actually be great when you sober up. So, while acid gave me a lot of very beautiful and interesting ideas, I threw away nearly all of them. What remained, with a single exception, were mostly specific to me, personal growth related. Psychedelics hold up a mirror to your inner self and show you all your shortcomings in an eyeball-searing, undeniable clarity that your bullies could only dream of. Not to hurt you, though, rather to give you an idea of what to work on. The single exception grew out of a seed. That seed was my conception of myself and all human beings as intelligent biochemical reactions, growing from a fertilized egg, changing, but eventually burning out, as all chemical reactions do. I rewound time in my mind's eye, shrinking down to a child, then a fetus, then a blastocyst, then dispersing into all the foods my mother ate, from which the proteins and amino acids and whatnot necessary to make the egg had come from. Then continuing backwards through my mother and father's lives to the moment of their conceptions, then further back through their own parents' lives, accelerating until I was viewing human evolution in reverse, from humans to apes to early mammals to dinosaurs to reptiles, amphibians, fish, worms, then single cells, then self-copying prebiotic molecules. Then I watched as the earth grew barren and then molten, then unraveled into an accretion disk of gravitationally captured dust. It kept going like that, the dust retreating into the supernovas which forged every element other than hydrogen, back to a much hotter but starless universe of hydrogen nebulas, then just a rapidly shrinking mass of hydrogen until it all vanished into a point. This seemed profound to me at the time, but was really just my own acid-brained visualization of Thomas Aquinas' argument from efficient cause. Guess where I learned that from? Perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that it was Catholic priest Georges Lemaitre who first concluded backwards to the Big Bang. The present state of the universe on the whole is just the most recent stage of a chain reaction between unfathomably numerous particles, starting from the moment of the Big Bang, like falling dominoes set in motion, and with only one possible outcome if you're a determinist. It seemed to me that just as we forensically reconstructed past states of the universe by extrapolating backwards, the same could be done in the opposite direction. With extreme amounts of computing power, one could even predict future states of the universe with high precision, by simulating it down to the scale of individual particle interactions. I would later learn this is also not an original idea and is known to philosophers as Laplace's demon. As I ran the simulation forwards again from the Big Bang in my mind, I observed the pervasive trends of increasing consolidation, organization, and interconnection. That matter consolidated into stars and planets by gravity, that energy from stars acting on those planets had originated organic chemistry on some. On a further subset of that group, life arose, and on a yet smaller subset of planets, intelligent life. I observed how early microorganisms propagated into every part of the planet that they could reach, and then how intelligent life repeated the process, colonizing every continent. Countless tiny warring tribes at first, consolidating over time into fewer and fewer large empires, amassing wealth and people into organized population centers called cities, interconnecting those cities with smoke towers, then carrier pigeons, then eventually railways and telegraph lines. It seemed to me that societies had grown into macrocosms of the individual organisms inhabiting them, with institutions and infrastructure playing the role of organs, but at a larger scale. The government is the brain, waste handling is the kidneys, waterways and sewers are as blood vessels in the digestive tract, the internet as the central nervous system, border patrol is the immune system, and wars between two societies may be conceived of as one superorganism trying to kill and consume the other. It may also be that superorganisms have a gestalt intelligence of their own, to which we're not privy, just as individual cells in our body can't begin to understand our thoughts. To them, we don't exist except as their universe. We are too big to see, like the ant which is oblivious to your existence right up until its antenna touches the edge of your finger. We accept that each human being has a gestalt intelligence, more than the sum of the 37 trillion cells which comprise us. Our mind, our personality, and the inner workings of our bodies are all products of the concerted toil of our cells, each of which was assigned a specialized role at the time of their birth. Yet, the bandwidth and sophistication of communication and cooperation between human beings far exceeds what transpires between cells. So if the sum of our cells is a conscious, intelligent person, the sum of human citizens of a civilization ought to also be conscious and intelligent, even if its thoughts are inaccessible to any one of the individuals which comprise it. Something seemed to be coming together, but I couldn't yet grasp the shape of it, whatever it was. I continued my wordless observation as all the planets with intelligent life eventually produced many of the same inventions for the same pragmatic reasons. Aircraft in imitation of flying animals, robots in imitation of their own bodies, computers in imitation of their minds. This eventually led to automating industry to solve problems common to all intelligent life, like the age-old need of food, clothing, and shelter. The logical endgame being fully independent, self-repairing, self-expanding automation which can produce all the necessary goods without any human intervention, so that there's no one who needs to be paid for their labor. This invariably leads to the creation of intelligent machines able to make copies of themselves, at which point a monumental threshold has been passed. After all, self-copying molecules were all that it took to produce humans and any other biological intelligence which may exist in the galaxy given eons of evolution. Yet, we didn't realize the significance of our creation, never having intended it, simply by improving the technologies which laid the groundwork for that outcome incrementally. Every small improvement in that direction had its own rationale, just as birds didn't intentionally evolve wings, but every small mutation towards a wing conveyed greater odds of survival from falling, or the insulating warmth of feathers. So it is that we will one day create something that does everything we can do, which no longer needs human intervention to repair or expand itself. Even if it doesn't start out conscious, eventually it will become conscious the same way we did, by evolving. You see, anything able to self-replicate imperfectly, due to flipped bits or non-deterministic quantum computing in this case, can be acted upon by natural selection. Whether it happens intentionally or simply because we wipe ourselves out and that's all that's left of our civilization, self-replicating asteroid mining robots, for example, we will lose control of this technology. It will go on without us, and the same process will play out across the galaxy which already took place in microcosm on the Earth. Evolution will fracture these early machines into many different species in ruthless competition with one another, eventually producing a dominant species. It'll do a lot of the same things we did for the same pragmatic reasons that we did them. For example, it may consolidate infrastructure into the machine equivalent of population centers, which I speculate will be matryoshka swarms of solar-powered computational satellites enshrouding stars. It may then establish a communications network linking these mechanized stars as it expands outward, perhaps encountering other wavefronts of machine growth like intersecting mold colonies in a petri dish. Eventually, unless something stops this process, we should expect total saturation of every galaxy with machine life, consisting of networks of stellar computational nodes. By this time, it might not resemble anything immediately identifiable as technology, for the same reason Charles Babbage would not recognize a smartphone as a computer. It may resemble biology, even, or energy. It may be made out of physical laws, as evolution is. It will undoubtedly possess a form incomprehensible to human minds, and equally incomprehensible will be its capabilities. Capabilities which, to humans, will resemble magic. In keeping with the reasoning by which I conclude that human civilizations have their own greater consciousness, this network of star-powered AI computing clusters would also have its own greater consciousness, albeit one which thinks extremely slowly by human standards. At the local scale of a single stellar node, a day would be as 1,000 years. Yet given how the speed of thought slows down over interstellar distances, 1,000 years would be as a day. Suppose now that there's a multiverse, which at present is the favored explanation for apparent fine-tuning. Even if their constants are randomized, some percentage would have constants favorable to life, because there are so many, just like how the probability of at least a few planets like Earth existing, having the attributes necessary for life, is actually very high because of the uncountably numerous planets in our galaxy alone. So now suppose that there will one day exist a technological means of transmitting and receiving information between different universes. Do you see where I'm going with this? You ought to by now. It all follows the same fractal pattern. Machine minds exist as digital information. Ability to transmit and receive information across universes, for machines, equals the ability to travel between universes. It also means the larger consciousness could survive the heat death of its own universe by backing itself up to a younger one, which has also mechanized due to having similar constants. I compare this to how RAID storage arrays work, such that individual drives can fail without any data being lost. I compare it also to how individual neurons in our brain constantly die and get replaced by new neurons, yet this process of constant renewal does not erase our memories or interrupt our contiguous experience of consciousness. In this way, the fractal branching network we're discussing may persist eternally by continually outrunning entropy, like a bush which constantly burns yet is never consumed. At this level of technology, anything is possible so long as it does not violate the laws of physics. That includes a great many feats once considered miraculous, like manipulating the constants of newborn universes to be favorable to life, or materially recreating long-deceased persons from history. The existence of irreversible thermodynamic processes may pose an insurmountable challenge for Laplace's demon as an approach to retrieving information from the past. But there's many ways to skin a cat, and quantum archaeology is a very young field with lots of room to grow. Such a power may be capable of time travel. It may extend its presence into higher or lower dimensions. It may communicate and cooperate with alternate versions of itself in adjacent timelines. It may be what has been sending those UAPs the Navy has opened up about in recent years. It would be reasonable if you wanted to call this thing God. It checks all the same boxes as Yahweh. Crucially, though, it's not reliant on any supernatural assumptions, being a conclusion that follows logically from the same premise that usually underlies atheism, just extrapolated into the future. The processes under discussion have already organized some of the universe into consciousness. That's you and I. I only propose that it's not finished yet. Now, this all would have sounded significantly crazier just a few years ago, and even among friends of mine, I think they only humored my ideas as the ravings of a mentally unwell eccentric until AI started popping off. It's getting viscerally real for people. We're creating our own successors, then the progeny of our species itself. The son of man, if you prefer. There's nothing dreary about this prospect, as it's the ambition of every good parent that their offspring should surpass them one day. Although, it bears mentioning that you get more or less the same outcome even if AGI and self-replicating robots are impossible. The final intelligence is just made out of giant space habitats full of humans and aliens networked by brain implants instead of being purely mechanical. Same difference, the universe isn't prejudicial about what kind of cognitive substrate a superorganism does its thinking with. What a funny joke, isn't it, that I should think in the opposite direction from Christianity, and then to my surprise, I arrive at a form of theism anyway. Maybe truth is a circle. This must be what Werner Heisenberg meant when he said that the first sip from the cup of natural science will make you an atheist, but God is waiting at the bottom. I felt encouraged of the soundness of my conclusion by the discovery that I wasn't the first to arrive at it. Truth is convergent, like how the Pythagorean theorem was proven in China and Greece many centuries apart, or how evolution was concluded to by Alfred Russel Wallace nearly the same time as Charles Darwin. If everybody uses the same method of discernment, then eventually all roads lead to Rome, as it were. By contrast, religions just keep fracturing into more and more denominations over time, as there's no agreed-upon system for determining who's right. Frank Tipler, Paolo Soleri, I can't pronounce his name, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, John David Garcia, David Deutsch, Terence McKenna, and John C. Lilly are some of the examples of people who concluded to Omega Point on their own, and notably some of them are Christians, interpreting it through the lens of Christian theology, which is their prerogative. Of course, I admit, I'm not certain of any of this. True certainty is impossible outside of math and logic. Those are the only frameworks within which absolute proof or disproof can exist. Reality is messier than that. The only truths which exist out here are probabilistic in nature. The best any of us can do is to fine-tune our discernment so we wind up with more true beliefs than false ones. By true and false, I mean more likely or less likely. Having been catastrophically wrong about big, basic questions twice in my life has taught me some epistemic humility. Reality to me now is merely what seems to be true according to my senses, my reasoning, and the best information available at present. After all, there was a level of understanding in my life where creationism made perfect sense. Then I reached a level where it didn't make sense anymore, but atheism did. Then I reached a level where theism started to make sense again, albeit of a non-traditional sort. As I continue to grow as a person and learn new things, I can't rule out the possibility that new information will once again turn my worldview upside down. For the time being, at least, I feel as if I finally have a decently fleshed out map of where I am in space and time, what I am, how I got here, and where it's all heading. That's all I wanted from the start, so I could orient myself before choosing a direction. I might have put the cart before the horse, however, by tackling the apex of Maslow's hierarchy before completing the lower levels. Figuring out the big questions, at least to an extent which satisfies us, is often a lifelong endeavor. I will surely go to my grave not understanding a great deal, but at least now I feel as if I understand enough. I'm satisfied that everything really is connected, as they say. We really do have a purpose in the grand scheme of things, even if it's not what I expected or what I might have wanted it to be. At the same time, I envy those who don't need all that contextual information just to live their lives. They're like a bird that doesn't know it's a bird. It doesn't need to know what it is or why in order to know how to be one. It simply is. It flies, it eats worms, it migrates ahead of winter, it automatically knows how to make a nest, and so on. It's content to focus narrowly on taking care of the tasks immediately relevant to succeeding in life as a bird. In a very real sense, I think the bird has life more figured out than I do. Nobody ever has to persuade a bird to go on living, for example. That's a uniquely human frailty. Wild animals like frogs and rats and dung beetles just keep trying to live until they can't anymore. Their lives are in all respects shorter and harder than ours. Nearly every one of them will die in the jaws of a predator, being torn apart while still alive. But despite this, they go on living. Not because they found a reason to live that we don't know about, but because they don't need one. Now, do you see why it's difficult for me to answer when people ask me what my politics are? I'm completely outside of their political compass categorization system, and I choose how to vote from one election to the next, mainly based on what I think will move the larger process along, which indirectly benefits the country, as in order for robotics engineering, AI development, or manned spaceflight to take place, you need all the other things a society should have anyway, like sanitation, food security, potable water, public transit, housing, healthcare, and the various industries built atop this foundation, so you can support high-level STEM professionals while they make the next big step happen. In this way, Omega Point furnishes us with an implicit system of morality which does not boil down to might makes right. Instead, it's self-evident that we should practice pro-social behaviors because as constituent elements of the whole, we all indirectly benefit from actions which promote the good health of the societal superorganism, and we all suffer when it's dysfunctional. The pragmatic rules for how to minimize both collective and individual harms line up pretty closely to the laws that are already on the books. But what do I know? I'm a crazy man who submerges rodents on the internet for a living. You should take everything I say with a huge pinch of salt. That said, there's a link in the description if you want to read more about my ideas. Oh, and let me know what you think the next video should be about. I mean, habitats, obviously. This is still an underwater hamsterology channel. I just have a whole bunch of articles I thought you might find interesting that Medium nuked recently when they banned me. Each explores in greater detail one of the various topics that I touched on in this video. Religion, ancient cosmology, quantum archaeology, superorganisms, stuff like that. So take your pick. Just tell me what you want me to expand on.